Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to this live stream. I'm delighted today to have Casey Luskin as a guest. Welcome, Casey, to the stream.
Oh, thank you so much. Great to be with you.
So, just a quick introduction for those of you who don't know Casey. That would actually be surprising if you don't know him, because in terms of the intelligent design discussions that have been happening, he's been very much at the forefront for many, many years now. So just a quick sort of introduction about him. He's a scientist and an attorney with graduate degrees in science and law, giving him expertise both in the scientific and legal dimensions of the debate over evolution. He holds a PhD in geology from the University of Johannesburg, where he specialized in paleomagnetism and the early plate tectonic history of South Africa. His actual credentials go on much longer than this, and in the description, I'm going to leave a link to the Discovery Institute page where you can find many of his works. Now, firstly, Casey, I'm so happy to have you on board. We're discussing a topic which usually is not at the forefront of these discussions. We get into the thick of it about intelligent design versus naturalistic Darwinism, but the problems in terms of getting the critique of Darwinism published and the cancel culture that's actually going on is not really discussed in any great detail. So could you give us an overview, because you've had over a decade of experience in this field. Where did this sort of thing come to the fore, and where are we now?
Yeah, I really appreciate you covering that aspect of this issue, Sabor, because you're right. It doesn't get talked about a lot. And as you said, I'm an attorney and I'm a scientist. And my first academic love was always science. I got my undergraduate and master's degree from UC San Diego in geology, and almost every elective course I had the opportunity to take, I took in evolution, because that was my primary interest in this topic, was to look at it from a scientific perspective. And I took almost enough courses to have a degree in evolution. So, I always have felt that it's the science that's either going to, show intelligent design is right or wrong. However, along the way, a lot of political, legal issues come up. And it's not because intelligent design folks are out there trying to file lawsuits to get evolution taken out of schools. I very strongly believe that evolution should be taught in schools. I think that students should learn about the evidence for evolution. I think that it's a very important theory in biology today. And when I say theory, I mean an idea that is well accepted within mainstream science. I think that it should be taught. However, it should be taught objectively, where students learn about the evidence supporting it and also the evidence challenging it, and they can make up their own minds, weigh the evidence, think critically, basically the way that all science education theorists essentially say that we should teach science, is to teach it objectively, critically, teach students about multiple views, let them learn to think critically and make up their own minds. So I'm very much against censorship, whether we're talking about censoring evolution, censoring intelligent design. And my experience when I was an undergraduate and master's student at UC San Diego, which is one of the largest, actually, I think it still is the largest public university in the United States for biology research. So, very biology focused school. My experience at that school, Sabor, and this is just an introduction to the bigger issue, but my experience was that we only learned about the pro-evolution view in almost every single. I did take one unit seminar that was like an elective course where there actually were pro-intelligent design views that were discussed, and it was supposed to be an interdisciplinary, learn about both sides kind of thing. But in every other course, it was almost exclusively pro-evolution, anti-intelligent design. Intelligent design in your normal core biology classes was not even mentioned. It was simply the pro-evolution view. And so what I experienced and what I saw is that students are being systematically uninformed and underinformed about this issue. They are simply not being taught that the intelligent design viewpoint even exists. If it is mentioned, it's mentioned in a caricature, where basically you're learning, sort of the dumbed down internet, ID critic version of intelligent design, which is not always very informed and not very accurate, and certainly not citing and quoting from actual ID proponents to let them speak for themselves. So this really got me interested when I was an undergraduate, having this very one-sided educational experience. And so when I finished my master's degree and decided to go to law school, I decided to look into the legal side of this issue, because I realized there is a gross freedom of speech problem with the origins question in academia and education today. And students are being systematically misinformed, and evidence is being censored from them in the classroom. They are not allowed to learn about any scientific evidence that challenges evolution or supports intelligent design. And there are a myriad of different ways that this sort of unofficial rule of censorship is enforced. But one of them is to basically intimidate and bully scientists in the academy who express dissent from Darwinism or support for intelligent design. So when I finished law school, and during law school, I did some independent studies and courses actually studying the evolution debate. I took a course under Edward Larson, who's a very famous legal scholar in the ID evolution debate, learned about the legal history of teaching of origins in American public schools. Took other courses, independent study from a very prominent constitutional law professor at my university and law school, and learned a ton about that side of the issue. And so when I started working at Discovery Institute in 2005, I basically, about 3 weeks after I started working at Discovery, Sabor, was the first day of the Kitzmüller versus Dover trial, which I'm sure you have heard of before. Maybe some of your listeners have heard of this as well. But that was a trial that took place in 2005 in central Pennsylvania. We're basically a very small rural school district. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
So just before we get into the Dover trial, I wanted you to elaborate a little bit about why your background in law is important for these discussions. Now, obviously, for anyone familiar with the discussions so far, we know Philip Johnson, who is pretty much the driving force behind the intelligent design movement. His landmark book, Darwin on Trial, it triggered this discussion. But why did you think it was important to both have the science and the law before we get into some of the details about Dover trial and other issues?
Well, I think for me, initially, it was just a personal interest. I was trying to understand, why did I have this experience throughout all my, kindergarten through master's degree at public schools? I went to public schools all the way through. Why did I have this experience where intelligent design was systematically censored from my classes? What was going on that made that happen? I just wanted to understand the world I was living in, because I could not understand, why would people not want to teach students about multiple views to make up their own minds? That I was raised with those kinds of values, that you should expose people to different ideas, let them think for themselves. Why was I being denied that opportunity in my classes? So for me, it was really just kind of a personal quest, but I also realized that, students were being, as I said, systematically misinformed, and what might the law be able to help us remedy that problem? And I actually ended up discovering through this process is that really I don't think that the solution, at least in the United States, is to go in and say, oh, schools should be legally compelled to, as far as say under the First Amendment, they have to teach intelligent design. No, I don't actually feel that way. I think that I think there should be academic freedom, but I don't think that teachers should be required to teach intelligent design, because what I learned is that intelligent design, as I said, is going to rise and fall on the evidence. And the only way that intelligent design is going to carry the day is if the scientific community can be persuaded that it's correct, and if scientists can actually see the evidence and think for themselves. And what happens when you bring intelligent design into public schools is it politicizes the debate. And that politicization ends up restricting the academic freedom for scientists in the academy who are trying to make a case for intelligent design. So I think the best thing for intelligent design to survive and thrive in the academy is to prevent it from becoming politicized, to not push it into public schools, to not turn it into a political hot potato. I think intelligent design should focus on research and not try to, make this become a big legal battle. So that's one of the conclusions I came to while studying law, ironically, is that I don't think that law is the ultimate solution to this issue. Now, that being said, when you have scientists and academics who are being discriminated and persecuted in the academy, you shouldn't just take that sitting down. You shouldn't just have them be walked all over by all the intolerant ID critics and Darwinians in the academy. And they will gladly walk over you if you let them. They want to have a one chorus, one-sided voice basically in the academy. That's what they want. And so you have to stand up for your rights when you're being persecuted. You know, you have to say, look, this is wrong. And I've worked on quite a few cases over the years. I still don't know if I'm answering your question. So
No, you are. You are actually
okay.
answering the question. Because why this is important is because I remember in the early days when these discussions went online, some of your opponents, while you were still studying, they kept pointing at your law background as if that was a negative thing. When I always considered that one of the reasons why Philip Johnson was so successful, because he could actually balance things out. And even if you are biased in terms of your own position, if you come from a law background, it's very hard to actually let that bias dictate what you're doing, because you have to weigh the evidence for what it is. So you gave a precise answer there. Now, can
I comment on that really quick? Sure. I really appreciate you remembering Philip Johnson and the contribution he made to this issue, because he really was a brilliant legal mind. I was very fortunate, and I was able to become personal friends with him. He spoke at UC San Diego in 1999 when I was still an undergraduate, and that ended up leading to the Intelligent Design Evolution Awareness Club movement getting started. And through all that, I became friends with him, visited him and his wife a number of times over the years in Berkeley, even visited him in the hospital when he had one of his strokes, during that time period of difficult health from the mid 2000s to the mid 2010s. And, he was a really wonderful person to be friends with, because he had his key insight was spotting issues. What is the core issue in the intelligent design evolution debate? And to give your listeners who may or may not be familiar with sort of the American history of the debate, in the 1970s and 1980s, and maybe even part of the 1990s, early 90s, the debate was primarily dominated by young Earth creationists versus atheistic evolutionists, okay? And there was very little middle ground. There were some old Earth, you might call them old Earth creationists out there, and there were some theistic evolutionists, but it was mostly young Earth versus the atheistic, full-blown scientific materialistic Darwinism view. And Philip Johnson said, look, the age of the Earth, all of that, okay, those are interesting questions. But the core issue is there a creator or not? Is there scientific evidence for intelligent design? Or is the whole show basically just this unguided materialistic process, and we have no evidence for intelligent design? And okay, if you want to baptize that view and be a theistic evolutionist who says, I believe in God, there's just no evidence for him, okay, fine. I mean, you can go that route. But, really, what does the evidence say about the big question of, is there a God, And Philip Johnson asked that question. He reframed the debate from young Earth creationists versus atheistic evolution to, is there evidence for a designer behind life in the universe? And so many people from all over the map on this issue, young Earthers, old Earthers, theistic evolutionists, atheists, agreed with him. That's the key issue. That's what we should be talking about. And many of those folks congregated around him and nucleated to become the intelligent design movement. Now, some people will say that Philip Johnson invented the term intelligent design or invented the concept of intelligent design. That is actually not true, and it's anachronistic. The term intelligent design and the scientific arguments were in existence and being developed before he even got involved with the debate in the late 80s. That work was being done in the late 70s, early 80s by scientists, not by lawyers. So intelligent design Philip Johnson was not the father of intelligent design, put this in the right place. He was we say he was the godfather. He was the one that brought people together, but he didn't actually give birth to the scientific ideas. But that was his key insight. And for your listeners who maybe don't know the history, that's why I think he was so important.
Absolutely. And you summarized it in a very interesting way. Everybody was going down the wrong garden path, right? Everybody was just having these discussions about the age of the Earth, or whether, things to do with punctuated equilibrium and whatnot. And then he came along and said, hey, everybody, this is what the real issue is. And I remember a few years back when I was also very much influenced by, okay, so, we've got this genetic issue to deal with and that to deal with. And then when I read his book, my mind it was almost like a paradigm shift, right, for me, because I understood, okay, now I get it. That's the issue, because in many ways, people like Michael Bihi, who, they are ambivalent towards universal common ancestry, their voices were not heard. It was just like, okay, you either believe in a 6,000-year-old Earth or you believe in Darwinism, and that false dichotomy forced a lot of people to just accept the Darwinian story.
Oh, you're 100% right. Yeah, it was like you're being told, if you don't believe in young Earth, then you have to be a full-blown, evolutionist, and that's never been true. So now, granted, there's a lot of young Earthers who like intelligent design. I'm not here to offend them, but at the end of the day, I think many of them would agree with me very much that the age of the Earth is not the core issue as far as what's at stake in the origins debate. I mean, I'm an old Earther, but and I think there's good evidence for an old Earth, but I still think the core issue is there evidence for design in nature? I think that's much more interesting.
No, absolutely, and there's many reasons why we need to unite upon at least this area. Whether someone believes in whatever the age of the Earth is, it is so important that because the Bible can. Somebody can try and extrapolate that, right? That's, but you can't say that's the only inference, and you can't say that is a point of major dispute that the Christian community is going to be at each other's throats for. There's another thing I wanted to ask you about, which is, so before we even get to the Dover cases, right? Philip Johnson was having a bunch of discussions up and down the country with evolutionists, and sort of debating the topic with the core idea in mind about naturalism and the belief in God, and how that colors the data that you look at, which was a very profound insight that he had. Could you just tell us a little bit about this, because this is one of those things that really stuck out, that your presuppositions will affect how you see the data, and that will affect the way that you will treat the other side. Because in some ways, if we link this to the philosophy of science, when Kuhn spoke about paradigms, one of the cases that he makes is that you cannot switch from one paradigm to another paradigm without some sort of religious experience, or you have to go through this shift. You can't just, from a perspectiveless perspective, weigh both paradigms, right? I hope I'm sort of...
No, you're absolutely. I mean, we're all human. We all come at the evidence with a paradigm. We like to think that we're objective, but the reality is none of us are perfect. None of us have that perfect objectivity. So you're the philosopher of science, Sabor. You have probably better things to say about this than me, but I agree with you very much on that. And I think that that was Philip Johnson's other key insight, was that Darwinian evolution and the whole materialistic evolutionary paradigm was being driven more by a naturalistic philosophy than it was by the evidence. Okay. Yeah. And I'm not somebody who says, oh, well, if you believe in evolution, you don't actually care about the evidence. You're just an atheist who wants to go have sex with everybody. No, I don't think like that. I mean, you find people who will talk like that, but people are legitimately convinced of Darwinian evolution in their own minds. I respect that. Okay. That's fine. But I think that what Philip Johnson showed is that we can look at the way that that Darwinian evolutionists approach the evidence and the way they talk about it, and you can see from their own writings that there are naturalistic blinders that are preventing them from seeing anything that does not involve material causes. And it's not so much that the evidence is demanding them to go to that conclusion that it's all material causes. It's a philosophical presupposition that they come to when they start looking at the evidence. And a lot of people at first didn't believe Philip Johnson, but then in 1997, there was this quote from Richard Lewontin, who was a Harvard evolutionary biologist who just passed away, actually, this past summer. And can I read this quote real quick, Sabor? Because I mean,
it's one of my favorite quotes in my talks, actually. So I'd love for you to, yeah.
Oh my. I need to text somebody really quick. I said it with my wife, and I have a lot of Muslim friends, actually, and we're having friends over for a birthday.
How about I read the quote while you text your...
Read the quote. I got to tell a person that he needs to walk to my house, that I can't pick him up until noon.
No worries at all. So the quote that we're actually speaking about is Richard Lewontin in terms of materialism. So if you folks just give me a moment. I haven't said this quote in a while, and I'm actually really happy to have this chance again.
Okay, I got it right here. I sent the text. So I'll read it if that's okay.
Perfect.
Okay. Our willingness to accept scientific claims that are against common sense is key to an understanding of the real struggle between science and the supernatural. We take the side of science in spite of the patent absurdity of some of its constructs, in spite of its failure to fulfill many of its extravagant promises of health and life, in spite of the tolerance of the scientific community for unsubstantiated just so stories, because we have a prior commitment, a commitment to materialism. It is not that the methods and institutions of science somehow compel us to accept a material explanation of the phenomenal world, but on the contrary, that we are forced by our a priori adherence to material causes to create an apparatus of investigation and a set of concepts that produce material explanations, no matter how counterintuitive, no matter how mystifying to the uninitiated. Moreover, that materialism is absolute, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door. Okay? So what did he just say? What he just said is that everything Philip Johnson said was right.
Yeah.
That the way that most evolutionary biologists approach the data is they come at it with materialistic, they call it methodological naturalism. For some of them are also philosophical naturalists, but they come at it either way with an assumption that there are no non-natural causes, no non-material causes involved in the history of life and the origin of life and the origin of the universe. And then they go from there. This is not a conclusion. This is an assumption. They don't derive this after careful studying. They assume this before they begin any studying. It's kind of like in computer programming. I've done a lot of computer programming. There's this phrase, garbage in, garbage out. Okay. So if you start with bad assumptions, you're going to come up with bad conclusions. I mean, that's just how logic works. That's how reasoning works. So whether it's right or wrong, let's just be clear. This is one of the leading evolutionary biologists of the 20th century from Harvard University saying that evolutionary biologists assume that materialism is absolute when they look at the data. So is it any wonder that they say there's no evidence for intelligent design? Well, of course there's no wonder, because they assume there's not any evidence for it, and they don't even think about intelligent design when they're doing their research. It's not even on their radar screen. Absolutely. It's like it doesn't exist. It's like they pretend it doesn't exist.
Absolutely. And this also highlights their circular reasoning, because what they would say is, well, if intelligent design was so great, why isn't it published in Nature? At the same time, they know that it could never be published in Nature because they hold on to methodological naturalism. So their conclusion's already presupposed in their assumption, and they say this as if they've discovered something new. So we really have to point out these issues. We can also highlight, for example, what Francis Crick says about this, that biologists must constantly keep in mind that what they see evolved wasn't designed. And recently, Nagel, in his book Mind and Cosmos, even though he's an atheist philosopher, he basically says the same thing, right? So that's pretty clear. Now let's get into the Dover trials, because it happened. I mean, it seems like it happened yesterday, but it really didn't. Give us a background and why this was so significant.
Sure. And before I do that, I want to say one thing. Next time someone tells you, I won't take intelligent design seriously unless it's published in Nature. Well, let me tell you what Nature published in 1999. They published an article that said the following: even if all the data point to an intelligent designer, such an hypothesis is excluded from science because it is not naturalistic.
Yeah.
Okay. This is from an article in Nature. So Nature will never publish intelligent design because they refuse to consider non-naturalistic hypotheses. So you'll never get even if all the data points to it. They're not interested in following the data. They're interested in naturalistic explanations. This is not a search for truth. This is a search for truth, provided that it is a search for naturalistic, basically naturalistic truth, if that exists. That's all this is. It's not an unfettered search for truth. So anyway,
absolutely.
Yeah. So, sorry.
Just in case you forgot, we were going to go over the Dover case next.
Okay, Dover case, yeah. So the Dover, and I'm sorry for getting too excited about this. I was
no. I mean, this is my, this is the crux of the matter. If we can't talk about these things, then we can't be accused of not having any evidence.
Sure. Well, I agree with that. And it's important for people to understand that it's not simply the evidence that is deciding this issue. I mean, and I'm not the one making this up. I'm quoting you from Nature,
Yep,
Harvard scientists
yep,
saying, look,
yep,
we
yep.
will not consider intelligent design. And it's not because of the evidence. It's because of an ideology that says we will not consider it. It's like you
Yep.
said, Sabor, it is circular reasoning. It is not a
Yep.
principled or it is an arbitrary exclusion of intelligent design, not a principled one. So
Absolutely.
let's get to the Dover case. Dover uh, was a small or is a small rural school district in central Pennsylvania. In
Yep.
2004, they passed a policy that required teachers to read a short little statement at the beginning of their biology class that basically referred students that, intelligent design, I'm sort of paraphrasing here, intelligent design is an alternative theory to Darwin's view. And if you want to learn more, there's this book in the library of pandas and people you can go read. Okay. That's literally all it said. I mean, I'm paraphrasing, but it was no more than that. Um, you know, mentioning to students in like a 3 or 4 sentence statement before class that intelligent design exists and you can go learn more in the library was far too much for intelligent design critics, especially some of the intolerant ones with groups like the ACLU. And within a couple months of the Dover School District passing that policy, they filed a lawsuit in federal district court, took this small district school district court in the Kitzmiller versus Dover case. Now, I just want to make clear, I was actually still in law school when all this happened. I was finishing up my last year of law school. I had nothing to do with the events that led up to the trial. In fact, I was not a party to the case. I once read somebody said that Judge Jones found that I was a liar on the witness stand. I was like, well, that's interesting because I don't even remember testifying in the Dover case. I did observe about a third of the trial in person. I sat, you can go sit on the benches in the back, and watch a court case. I did sit in the benches at the back, and I quietly sat there and took notes and did some reporting on the case for Evolution News, which is Discovery Institute's news blog. But I had no, legal involvement with the case. Discovery Institute did help to file some amicus briefs, which are called friend of the court briefs, where you file briefs with a court when you're not a party to a case, but you're sort of an outside group with an interest in the case. But I was not, officially involved with the case in any way. But I did observe about a third of it in person. So what happened was...
Sorry, just before you continue, for anybody who's missed out on this, Casey was the go-to punching bag for a lot of these Darwinists, even Jerry Coyne. And one of the interesting things was at the time you were quite young, right? You were just getting into it. But for some reason they kept, there's a lot of them who actually were seeing you as the architect behind a lot of this. When, like you said, you were just a messenger. You were just conveying certain ideas.
Total conspiracy. I've heard more conspiracy theories from the Darwinian internet crowd than you hear from a UFO convention or something. I mean, it's crazy. Yeah. No, I definitely. I really appreciate Sabor. You have a great knowledge of the history of this issue, and I appreciate that you remember some of this stuff because I was like 27.
Following it live, it was like a it was like a football match. You could see one side, another side, all this internet blogging stuff, and I mean, I can't remember like all of the details, but there were some significant events. I remember you being, a key part of this. Sorry, I interrupted you. So what was the last thing that you said?
Well, so just, during this case, the school district, so I'll give a little bit of background here. In American law, there is a 3-part test for deciding whether a government policy violates the Establishment Clause, which is the part of the U.S. Constitution which says that the government may not establish religion, may not take sides when it comes to religion. And the first thing says that whatever government policy you have, it cannot be passed due to a religious motive. The second part says that the principal or primary effect of that law can neither advance nor inhibit religion. And then the third part says there can be no excessive entanglement between government and religion. Okay. So when the school board in Dover was deliberating on this case, some of the school board members made explicitly religious motives, expressed very clearly religious motives for passing their policy. Okay.
Yeah.
And Discovery Institute had the same approach to the Dover to intelligent design in public schools back then that they do now, which is don't push it into public schools.
Yeah.
So this was before I joined Discovery, but one of my predecessors at Discovery, Seth Cooper, who was an attorney, had contact with the Dover School Board and said, look, do not pass this policy. Do not push intelligent design into your curriculum. It is going to only cause problems for you and for intelligent design. It's going to do no good. It's not a wise policy. Instead, you should focus on evolution. Teach evolution objectively. It's already in the curriculum. You're not bringing a new topic in. Teach it objectively, and that's a better way to do it. So in the end, the judge did find that Dover's policy was unconstitutional. Now, I would agree with part of the ruling where he found that Dover's specific policy, this is like a peculiar fact of just what happened in Dover specifically, that they did express religious motives behind their policy. And under that part of the Lemon test, which says you can't have religious motives, the policy probably was unconstitutional. Now, whether we should be looking at motives or not when we evaluate whether a law should be allowed is a separate question. I mean, maybe a school, maybe a city council passes a law saying, I believe we should feed the homeless because our religious beliefs teach us that's a good thing to do. Well, everybody agrees we should feed the homeless. Are we going to strike that law down as unconstitutional? Maybe you have a mix of, Muslims, Jews, and Christians who all believe in taking care of the poor, and together this city council, this ecumenical city council, passes a policy. Our religious beliefs say we should feed the poor. Well, I don't know if you should strike a law down simply because people want to do something good for society. So whether religious motives should matter is a separate question, but it's the law.
Sorry to cut you off. Just on that point, it's actually a genetic fallacy because the origin of something does not dictate the truth value of it. So their religious motives, I mean, we could do, we could argue Darwinists actually have a religious motive as well, and that naturalistic story of theirs, the door swings both ways here.
100%. If you want to play the motives game, I mean, many leading evolutionary scientists have expressed stridently anti-religious motives for doing what they're doing. Now, I'm not saying that therefore evolution isn't science. I'm just saying let's not commit the genetic fallacy. Exactly as you said, Sabor, a person's personal religious or anti-religious beliefs has no bearing on whether their science is good science, their law is good law, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. So, but at the end of the day, the law is the law, and the law says that you can't have religious motives in the United States for passing a policy. And so under the law, I accept that this law or this policy from the Dover School Board was unconstitutional under the motives test. But Judge Jones, the judge in this case, went way further than that. Normally, according to Supreme Court precedent, if you find that a law was passed for a religious motive, you should just stop right there and end your analysis. But Judge Jones decided to go much further in this case and decide all kinds of expansive questions, which I think are way beyond anything that the judiciary, that a court should be deciding. Questions like, how do we define science? Is intelligent design science, or is intelligent design religion? Is evolution compatible with religion? Is the type 3 secretory system a potential precursor, evolutionarily speaking, to the bacterial flagellum? Is there good evidence that the immune system evolved? These are all questions that the judiciary has no specific expertise in and is totally ill-equipped to evaluate. And in the end, when Judge Jones made all these expansive rulings, he found that intelligent design is not science, that it's a religion, that intelligent design is unconstitutional to teach in public schools under any circumstances, whatever your motives might be. He found that that evolution and religion are compatible. I mean, these are things that no court should be deciding. And so,
sorry to cut you off again.
It's fine.
It's like the O.J. Simpson case for science, except on steroids. I mean, many of these things are just absolutely ridiculous. It's almost like you could say it's almost like a hijacking of a minor case to make macro policies for the entire nation, essentially.
You're absolutely right. And, the definition of an activist judge is a judge who tries to settle cases and disputes that are outside the specific case that is before her or him. Okay. Yeah. And so Judge Jones had this really bizarre statement in his ruling where he knew that he was going to be called an activist judge for doing this. So he tried to preemptively oppose the claim that he was going to be an activist judge. I don't have the exact quote in front of me, but he said, yeah, I can't find it here, but he basically said, this court is not an activist court. And I was like, well, methinks thou dost protest too much, Judge Jones, because no, I've never, of all my cases I've read in my life, I've never seen a single court that actually addressed in the case, you know, preemptively the accusation before anybody could even say anything that they were an activist judge. But the reality is that if you look at like judicial and legal textbook definitions of judicial activism, it is trying to address cases and controversies that are outside the specific case that you are presented with. And Judge Jones actually said in interviews later, he wanted his ruling to serve as a quote unquote primer for people elsewhere who are dealing with the issue. Well, that's the definition of judicial activism, is you're trying to basically settle the issue for everybody for all time. But anyway, that aside, I mean, whatever. So he's an activist. Doesn't mean he's right or wrong. He got so many things wrong in the case. In fact, this tells you just about everything you need to know. One of the leading anti-intelligent design legal scholars, his name is Jay Wexler. He's at Boston University. I met him before. He's a very nice guy. No friend of intelligent design. He's written quite a few legal journal articles against ID. This is what he said. He said, the part of Kitzmiller that finds ID not to be science is unnecessary, unconvincing, not particularly suited to the judicial role, and even perhaps dangerous to both science and freedom of religion. Wow. I mean, so when people say, oh, well, Judge Jones was appointed by George Bush too, and therefore he was a conservative, and whatever. Judges rarely go along with whatever the president who appointed them believes. This is all you need to know. When a leading anti-ID legal scholar says that his arguments that ID is not science are basically bad arguments, they're unconvincing, it's not good for the judicial role, and dangerous to freedom of science and religion, I mean, those are things that we've been saying. And this is coming from an anti-ID legal scholar. So the Dover case is full of inaccurate statements about intelligent design. I mean, we can debate all day about how we define science and whether intelligent design should be science or not. Judge Jones basically said that science is defined by methodological naturalism. So he said that, you know, because intelligent design does not accept methodological naturalism, therefore it's not science. Well, I think that's not a good way to do science, but whatever, you know, we could debate that. Let's just talk about some black and white questions, all right? Judge Jones ruled in something like 5 places in the case that intelligent design has no peer-reviewed scientific publications or research. That's a black and white question. It's either ID does or it doesn't. Well, I can tell you it does. We documented to Judge Jones about a dozen peer-reviewed publications from ID theorists, Cambridge University Press, mainstream scientific journals, explicitly supporting intelligent design. We documented this to Judge Jones in our amicus briefs. And yet he just ignored this evidence and said in the ruling that ID has no peer-reviewed scientific publications or research. And then he said that that is evidence that ID is not science. Oh, really? So now we're getting into the sociology. So the fact that ID is being systematically excluded from Nature says it will never publish intelligent design, and therefore ID isn't science. It's like this circular argument, you know, we won't publish it because it's not science, and it's not science because it didn't get published. Well, the fact of the matter is that it has been published. And it has done research. We cited some research from Doug Axe looking at the specified and complex nature of amino acid sequences in proteins and how that points to intelligent design. Doug Axe is obviously a leading ID researcher. We cited all this to Judge Jones. He just ignored it like it doesn't exist. So there's quite a few aspects of the Dover ruling that I would say definitely are inaccurate and would make it so that it should not be taken very, very seriously as a good treatment of intelligent design.
Absolutely, absolutely. And if anything, you know, Darwinists would see this as a victory, but it's a Pyrrhic victory because it showed their true colors. And one of the most disingenuous things for people with a background in philosophy is for a judge to think he can resolve what is science and what is not science. Well, you know, what's the point of having philosophy departments all across the world? You know, if a judge with no credentials in it can just hand wave and decide what is science and what is not science. But on this point, I just wanted you to highlight here something that you mentioned about the sociological, you hinted towards it, the sociological impact of this case. right? Because I think that's important. The impact that this case had in terms of the intelligent design and Darwinism discussion in the United States.
Yeah, let me say one thing, that if your listeners want more information on the Dover case, I'll give you a link, Sabor, that you can post. I've got a 2-hour video lecture on YouTube where I go through all the problems with the Dover ruling. We're just touching the surface here, and I don't want to bore your listeners with all that. But I'll give you that link if you want to send that out to folks on your channel. But so what are the sociological implications? So one of the amicus briefs that was filed with Judge Jones was signed by a number of scientists who were concerned about academic freedom being at risk and at stake and threatened by this lawsuit. Okay, academic freedom for scientists who support intelligent design. And what we said in this case, or what we wrote in these amicus briefs, was that, look, if you go so far as to rule that intelligent design is not science, then what's going to happen is it's going to then abridge academic freedom of scientists in the scientific community, good people who are trying to do their research, who are going to be persecuted and harassed because of their support for intelligent design. And we warned Judge Jones that there was a risk to academic freedom if he ruled too expansively and if he ruled in a particular way. I mean, like we said, judges have no business deciding what is science and making it clear that this is or is not science. That's for philosophers of scientists like you, Sabor, to decide, or that's for the scientific community to decide. It's not for judges to decide. And when judges do that, you risk intolerant folks in the scientific community misusing a legal ruling and using it to persecute and harass people out of the scientific community. We warned Judge Jones that this could happen if he did this. And it's one of those times where you were right, but you wished you weren't right, because it is exactly what happened. In the wake of the Dover trial, Sabor, from I would say, late 2005 until around 2010, we saw an intense spike in the amount of persecution of pro-ID scientists and faculty in academia. And I know this because it was my job to work on a lot of these cases. And some of these cases you've never heard of, because we worked behind the scenes to try to get things resolved, and it went away, okay? But some of these cases you have heard of, especially if you saw the documentary Expelled. That documentary told the story of a number of these scientists who faced discrimination because of their support for intelligent design or their questioning Darwin. And this is very real. I mean, these are credible scientists who were just doing their work, not trying to go and cause problems. And when they came up for tenure or contract renewal or grants or trying to get papers published or just general interaction with their colleagues, they were treated terribly. And in some cases, they lost their jobs, they lost their funding, they lost their lab space, they were denied tenure, they were sort of unofficially blacklisted, so they couldn't get jobs or interviews even. This happened to people. And for years, and it's frankly, it is actually still happening today. We have active academic freedom cases that we're assisting folks with right now at Discovery Institute in October of 2021. But, it's certainly, there was a real intense sort of a purge, you might say, in the 5 to 10 years following Dover. And absolutely. It's really, really a sad thing. Yeah,
it is. And again, the reason why we're highlighting this case is because of these things, that the impact of these things are felt much, much later. A friend of mine is, very close to a biologist in the UK, an academic, and he had some very interesting insights in terms of common ancestry. And, he just said to him, look, I can't say this publicly, though. So, this isn't just, Casey Luskin from the intelligent design community saying, I've dealt with these cases. I mean, everyone knows somebody who has, have had to self-censor. Another thing which is important to highlight here is that it's not just that if you're an intelligent design proponent, you will be cancelled and you will be, pressurized into these types of things. It's even people who are critics of Darwinism, yet they may be agnostic, they may be, atheist. So Jerry Fodor comes to mind. He was called a secular creationist. Thomas Nagel, Eva Jablanka, and, there's so many of these people. So could you go into why is it important that despite these obstacles that we sort of plow through, we bulldoze through, why is it important we keep this up? Because the intention behind people who want to stop these discussions essentially is to demotivate us. But how would you inspire people to say, no, we need to carry on speaking about this, we need to carry on doing things like the Expel documentary and making sure we're not silenced?
Well, it's important because if we care about truth and we want to preserve our rights and ability to search for truth, then we need to stand up for academic freedom and intellectual freedom, because there are a lot of folks out there that are more than happy to take away those rights. If you don't use them, you lose them. I mean, there is some truth to that. You don't use your rights, you will lose those rights. And I just want to backtrack a tiny bit here, Sabor. I find it very ironic when sometimes evolutionists will say to me, "Oh, there's no persecution of IT people in the academy." Oh, really? Well, like you said, don't take it from me. Let's take it from Jerry Coyne. Here's what Jerry Coyne said. He said, adherence to ID, which after all claims to be a non-religious theory, should be absolute grounds for not hiring a science professor. Okay? So I take that, if Jerry Coyne says that, I take him at his word, that if there was, say, an absolute grounds, that means, I guess, if there was a Nobel Prize winner who applied for his department who happened to be pro-intelligent design, he wouldn't hire him. And Jerry Coyne puts his money where, he walks his talk. In 2013, Jerry Coyne was the primary person who was harassing Eric Hedin, a physicist at Ball State University, who briefly mentioned intelligent design in a little one-unit elective seminar. He mentioned it favorably, and Jerry Coyne was responsible for having, working with the Freedom from Religious Foundation to harass Eric Hedin, to silence him, to get that class canceled, and ultimately have a speech code. Well, when I say canceled, I mean they refused to let him teach the class the way he wanted. And ultimately a speech code was passed at Ball State University that prevented intelligent design from being discussed favorably in classrooms. So Jerry Coyne actually puts his words into practice. You mentioned Jerry Fedor. Listen to what Fedor says. He said he was a card-carrying atheist. He described himself as. He was a cognitive scientist. He said, "We've been told by more than one of our colleagues that even if Darwin was substantially wrong to claim that natural selection is the mechanism of evolution, nonetheless, we shouldn't say so, not anyhow in public. To do that, however, is inadvertently to line oneself with the forces of darkness, whose goal is to bring science into disrepute." He goes on to say, "Neo-Darwinism is taken as axiomatic. It literally goes unquestioned. A view that looks to contradict it, either by directly or by its implication, is ipso facto rejected, however plausible it may seem otherwise. Entire departments, journals, and research centers now work on this principle." So he's saying, look, and he was a critic of he was an evolutionist, but he was a critic of natural selection, saying, I'm not allowed to criticize the Darwinian view, the mainstream Darwinian view. Daniel Hillis, another evolutionary scientist, says, "There's a feeling in biology that scientists should keep their dirty laundry hidden because the religious right are always looking for any argument between evolutionists as support for their creationist theories. There's a strong school of thought that one should never question Darwin in public." Okay, so even evolutionists admit that there is pressure to censor their criticisms of evolution. There's many other quotes like this from evolutionists who are complaining about the fact that we can't say what we really think. Well, if they can't say what they really think, imagine what it's like to be an intelligent design proponent in the academy. We really can't say what we think, not much less get it published in journals and get a fair hearing where we're actually taken seriously. Okay, so there's a real problem. We like to think of science as this perfectly objective, trustworthy enterprise that evaluates data objectively without politics or personal concerns or sociology or worldview or ideology or whatever. But I'm sorry, that's not the world we live in. Okay, I'm not saying science is a bad thing. I mean, I just got a PhD. I spent 5 years in the scientific community. I loved it. I mean, there's great people in science, a lot of wonderful people. But science is highly political. Okay, it's just a fact. And if you think that it's always evaluating the data, and don't take my word for it, listen to all these evolutionary scientists who are saying you can't criticize evolution or the Darwinian view or support ID. Okay, I mean, this is a reality of the world we live in. So don't think that because don't take any comfort in ID not being published in this journal or that journal, if you're an atheist or an evolutionist. Okay, take no comfort in that. It says nothing about the merits of intelligent design. It says something about the sociology of the issue, but it says nothing about the merits of your worldview.
Absolutely, that's a brilliant way to actually say it. What we have to keep at the forefront of our mind is that Darwin's idea itself was fringe at one point. And if it wasn't for the fact that the idea came about in 1859 as opposed to 1759, the sociological environment was such that it flourished. In fact, it fitted well with contemporary times. So when it comes to intelligent design, I want everybody to just consider something. When you have people like David Belinsky, who is not religious, when you have people like other ID proponents who may show religion, some believe in universal common ancestry, some don't, some atheists like Nagel, the atheist philosopher, who are calling for more freedom, on the minimum, we should think to ourselves, okay, something's wrong. Because you got people who are religious, people who are not religious, people who are fully fledged Darwinists, but they still want to have more freedom. They are all saying the same thing. So there must be something there. And I want everybody to just at least reflect about that, even if you are on the other side, because I know some people in the chat definitely are not with us. But nonetheless, this is very, very important. So Casey, for people watching, I want them to, connect with your work and just keep up to date. So where can they find your work and what are you up to, most recently?
Sure. And let me just agree with everything you just said, Sabor, 100%. Every scientific revolution that has ever happened started off as a minority scientific view. If we do not give intellectual freedom to minority scientific views, then science can never progress. And science is becoming more and more politicized. I mean, you can read op-eds in just about every major newspaper over the last couple of years about the politicization of science. Wall Street Journal has some great writing on this topic. The increased politicization of science. It's only getting worse. This is not good for the ability of science to advance and correct its past mistakes. So we should be, if you love science, and I personally do, if you love science and you care about its ability to correct inaccurate information, to find truth, to overturn wrong ideas, you should be very concerned about what's going on in science today. And it's not just the ID evolution issue, it's many other issues. Although I think ID and evolution is kind of where the intolerance and the politicization really started. I think a lot of the cancellation methods that are now being used in other scientific fields, they were invented and honed working on us ID proponents, and so they kind of figured out how to do it on us, but now it's spreading to other scientific fields, and it's really dangerous. And it certainly is totally still there with intelligent design. But if folks want to look up any of my work, you can go to evolutionnews.org, is Discovery Institute's news site. Great resource. We have articles pretty much every day covering the ID evolution debate, science, primarily science, but also sociology, occasionally some theology. We'd love to get other voices contributing there. So Sabor, send me something and we'll get you published there. It's a fun little website. Also, my personal website is CaseyLuskin.com. A lot of my own personal writings are there. You can check it out for some of my articles and books and other things I've written. That's
brilliant. And do you have any social media where people can follow you?
Not really. I'm kind of like not on social media. I'm not on Facebook. I'm not on Twitter. But go to Evolution News or go to CaseyLuskin.com, and you can get Discovery Institute has a great YouTube channel with lots of great videos. We have great Twitter. We have a great Facebook page that's very active. So I think I'll just vicariously live through those social media pages.
That's absolutely brilliant. It's been a pleasure speaking to you. I don't want to, overpraise you to your face, but you've definitely made a huge contribution in this field at this young age, by the way, because, when we look at the likes of Philip Johnson, he really started his contribution to this field in his 50s. And, that's phenomenal in 20 years, what he managed to do. So we hope that in the next 20, 30 years that, we see a lot of great stuff from you, Casey. So it's been a pleasure. Thank you for joining us. For everybody watching, please go to CaseyLuskin.com, also Evolution News, and the link to Casey's biography is also on the Discovery Institute website, which I've put up. So I definitely want to bring him in the future again, discussing these issues. Today we did a sort of broad brush coverage of the issues. I'm sure there's a lot more niche areas we can go into. So, Casey, is there any other last message you'd like to give to the
No,
audience?
just you're really kind, Sabor. I appreciate your kind words, and I look forward to seeing contributions from you as well on this issue. I know you got a lot of great things to say, and I'm really impressed with your knowledge of the history of the issue. I mean, you remember a lot of things that need to be remembered, and I really do appreciate that. So it's great to meet you, and I look forward to more interaction.
You're welcome. So everybody watching, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa